Hi everybody, this is Mom. Today we're making bread. I'm going to show you some of the tricks that I do, some of the shortcuts or bypasses I use to the recipe, also some things that I've just learned along the way. So I am using an old German Zwieback recipe, which includes milk and eggs in the bread recipe. So one of the things that I've done different is that I grind my own wheat to make wheat flour as part of the recipe. In addition to that, you're also going to need some water, sugar, eggs, vegetable oil, and yeast, and also additional white flour, which I use unbleached white flour. Alright, so we start off with wheat kernels. They are from a farm. Hopefully no pesticides have been used on this. We try to get organic or at least just really good wheat. So this is the grinder. I use a Magic Mill 3 and it's going to be very loud, but I turn it on and once it gets up to speed I pour in the wheat and then it grinds it into flour. So here we go. Watch out, it's going to be loud. Okay, so here we have ground wheat into flour. Unfortunately, I had a bad thing happen in that the grinder broke while we were grinding and I had to stop using it. So we only got about maybe 2.5 cups of flour here. But one of the reasons I'd like to tell you about cooking and how I do things is that things always happen that you don't expect. You run out of an ingredient or something happens like this, and that doesn't mean you have to stop your recipe. You just improvise. So today we're going to have a very light wheat bread, but we'll continue with the recipe anyway. Okay, so the first thing the recipe calls for is 3 cups of scalded milk. And I have done that many times, scald the milk, add it to the recipe, let it cool. But what I've discovered through trial and error is that I can just get hot water out of the faucet, as hot as it comes. Of course, our water is really good to drink, so it's okay to do. And measure, since it calls for 3 cups, I use 1 cup of powdered milk, and I add that to a measuring cup. Then I add the 3 cups of very hot water. It's almost too hot to touch. Then I measure it up to the 3 cups, and I call it good for my 3 cups of scalded milk. I've made this many times, and the recipe turns out just fine. I don't really know the purpose of scalding milk. I'm sure there is a purpose for it, but the recipe turns out fine, and I still get the goodness of milk in the recipe. Alright, the first part of the recipe says to add sugar and salt to the scalded milk. So I start with the warm milk, add it to my mixer bowl. Alright, and the recipe calls for 3/4 cup of sugar. So I have this measuring cup that actually holds 3/4 of a cup. But I first dump maybe a tablespoon into another measuring cup that I'm going to use later to measure my yeast. Then I take the rest of the sugar, add it to the warm milk. Also asks for about 3 3/4 tablespoons of salt, but I just reduce that down to a tablespoon. And I mix that in the warm milk, and that's the first mixture we mix together. Alright, the next ingredient is 1.5 cups water. So I've done a lot of things with this in the past, and today I am also using what I call potato water. This is water that was used to boil potatoes, and I usually save it because the vitamins boil off into the water, and then usually we just pour that out. But as you can see, I have it in a kettle here, and I'm warming it I don't want it cold from the refrigerator where I was storing it. So I'm going to measure that. This is just what I had left, and I'm using the same measuring cup as the milk was in, so that's why it's milky. But I'm going to pour it in there and see if I have 1.5 cups. Well, it's pretty close. I'm just going to grab a little hot water from the sink and finish my measuring so I get right up to the 1.5 cups. And then we will just add that to the milk in place of just the regular water. Alright, so now we want to measure the yeast and let it proof, which means that the yeast gets a little foam on the top, and that's how you know that it's ready. You don't want to ruin your whole batch of dough by yeast that's dead or isn't working. So the recipe calls for 1.5 cups of warm water. Again, I'm starting with about 1 tablespoon of sugar in the bottom. Then we measure the 1.5 cups of warm water. When you're making bread, it's not an exact science. It can be just a little bit off on the measurements and it'll still turn out. So the yeast is 2 1/4 tablespoons, so I just take the active dry yeast and sprinkle it on the top of the water. 2, and I don't get out a teaspoon and measure 1/4. I just estimate. So there is the yeast, and you don't just leave it on top. You need to stir that in. The sugar actually helps the yeast divide. Yeast eats sugar. So you get it mixed in. It's okay if it's a little lumpy, but it's better if you can get it down to smaller lumps. And this needs to sit, a few minutes. If it's working well, it will start to foam up pretty quickly. But I'll leave that rest for a minute. Okay, so while the yeast is rising, I add most of the other ingredients right here to the recipe. So the first thing I need is 3/4, well, what I'm doing is doing 1.5 times the recipe. So it calls for 3/4 cup of oil. So instead of, again, doing all the math and measuring what's half of 3/4, I just estimate half of the container, dump that in. 3/4 cup of oil plus half. Okay, so we added that. Then I'm going to add my wheat flour. Normally I have about 5 cups of wheat flour, so I've got about half of what I usually use. Of course, you can use no wheat flour, or you can use all wheat flour. It doesn't rise quite as much, but it is probably healthier to use the whole wheat flour. So I put that in, and now I add about half of the unbleached flour that I normally do. So it calls for about 15 cups of flour, so I'm going to put in probably about 8 right now. Of course, I already have the 2.5 of the wheat, but 1, 2, 6, 7, and I'm just calling a scoop a cup. It might be a little over or a little under. Again, it's not an exact science. But to the wheat now, of course, I don't have it all in. Now I'm going to add the eggs, and normally I do that with the flour as a barrier because I don't want the eggs in that super hot liquid down there. I don't want them to in any way cook. So I just lay my eggs right here on the top of the flour, and there are 3 eggs for this recipe I'm doing today. Alright, so look at the yeast. See how that has risen? It's almost to the top of my 2-cup container, which shows we're going to have a really good recipe today. So now I add that directly in here with the flour and the eggs, and we'll be getting to mixing shortly. Alright, so I put the cover on, and basically I'm just mixing the wet into the dry together, and hopefully it won't poof out flour too much. dough consistency. Of course, it's way too wet yet. So as it kneads, or as it mixes, I add flour cup by cup until it gets to be the right consistency. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I watch the inside of the bowl. Right now the dough is sticking to the inside of the bowl, and my clue to whether it's done or not is if it stops sticking to the inside of the bowl. So at this point I stop it to add flour, otherwise it'll come back into the room and make a mess of things. So here we go, and we'll see. We might need another. I've added, this is the 6th cup of flour I'm adding now since we started this. You hear how it's starting to do the kneading sound? The motor sound has gone down, and I can take this off. You can see how it's sort of cleaning the edges now. It's still a little on the sticky side, but I'm going to let it go for a bit, and it actually should knead for about 10 minutes at this point. So it has only gone a minute or two here, but I'm stopping to check the consistency of the dough. See how it does not stick to my fingers? This is a very good dough. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and let it go the rest of the 10 minutes, and I don't need to add any additional flour. Alright, so that makes 10 minutes of kneading time. And here it is, a beautiful dough. Doesn't stick to my fingers. All I have to do now is take it out of the mixing bowl and put it in this bowl. I've lightly greased the edges, and it will rise for an hour now. Alright, so it's pretty much out of the bowl here. And we have 2 rising times now that we need to let the yeast do what it does. So I'm just a little bit of hand kneading, doesn't really need a whole lot, but I've got the bottom part is touching the greased area, so now just turn it over. Now the whole thing is covered with a light coating of vegetable oil. So there it is. We're going to let that sit for 1 hour, then we're going to come back, punch down the dough, and give it another hour. So you can kind of see how much dough there is there in the pan, and then you'll see how it looks when we come back later. I just use a thin tea towel. Then I put a plastic bag, this is just a plastic garbage bag, over that. It gives a barrier that holds the moisture in. And I just add another tea towel on top of that, just to hold everything in place. See you in an hour. Alright, so it's been an hour. So we're going to take off these layers. There it has raised right to the top of the bowl and rounded. All we do at this point is punch it down, removing the air bubbles that it has made. And I just scrape the edges, roll it back up into a ball, which it is slightly bigger than what we started with. And then we let it sit for another hour. This will make it nice and fluffy. Alright. Okay, so now we want to prepare the pans to put the buns on. I just use a cooking spray and just do just a little. I'll just prepare 2 pans for now. The dough's been rising for another hour. There it is. Beautiful. Nice and airy. So I do spray just a little bit on my hand to keep the dough from sticking. And I'll grab a handful of dough. It's not too sticky. It's just right, actually. So then I make a bun. It's actually a little bit bigger than an egg. Actually, I have an egg right here. There you go. So it's about 1.5 sizes of an egg. And then I just put that down on the greased spot. So I will just pinch it off at the bottom. The top part is rounded. You make it so it's a nice smooth top. Pinch it off between your thumb and your first finger. And after I get a whole pan of these, then I'm going to go along and just smash them completely down so that I get a nice big round bun, and it will of course rise again and not look like this in about 45 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do now, is just fill my pans. Okay, so look how nice they've raised. So the first thing you do is check it. See how I poke it and it kind of leaves an indentation? That means it's done raising. If it pops right back out, it could still raise some more. But it will rise a little bit while it's baking as well. So we have the oven to 400 degrees, and we will put this in here for 15 minutes. All right, so the timer has rang and I have reset it a few more minutes, and it's now been about 18 minutes, but it depends on your stove. It's set for 400, and that's about how it should look. Nice and golden brown. So we'll take it out, nice and hot, let it cool here a few minutes. I'll put the next pan in. Set that for 15 minutes. All right, so all that's left for this is to add some butter on the top. That's optional. If you're gonna have a nice warm one now, I'd recommend the butter. They're great for cutting in half for big thick sandwiches, or I even cut them in thirds the long way. Gives you a centerpiece for toast and still gives you a nice, fairly good amount of bread for a sandwich, hamburger bun, whatever you want to use it for. Anyway, hope you enjoy your fresh bread.